Hello, and welcome to OIB-TAC's monthly webinars. I'm Jennifer Ottowitz, older blind specialist with OIB-TAC. And our topic today is introducing Braille. And I'm really excited because today is World Braille Day, January 4th. That's when we're recording this conversation. And I cannot think of two better people to spend the day with talking about Braille than our two guests, Dr. Natalie Martiniello and Polly Abbott. Hi, ladies.
Hi, happy World Braille Day.
Great to have you. So I thought we could start out by having you each share a little bit about yourself and your connection with Braille. So Natalie, how about you go first?
Sure. So as mentioned, my name is Natalie Martiniello, and I'm a researcher and a course instructor at the University of Montreal, where we prepare future vision rehabilitation professionals. And before that, I worked as a vision rehabilitation therapist here in Canada. And most importantly, I'm a lifelong Braille user. So I've been using Braille since I was very young. And at the time, I still had low vision. And very grateful that I learned it early on, so that once I did lose the rest of my vision, I was able to continue kind of pursuing all my various goals. So I'm very, very happy to be here.
Thanks. And Polly, how about you?
Well, I am also an older blind specialist at the OIB-TAC. I work with Jennifer. But before that, I worked in direct service for over 20 years, both in Canada and the US. And I came to Braille, I am sighted, but I remember reading a couple of books as a child on, the life of Helen Keller and different things where I was introduced to the idea of Braille. And I'd always had an interest in other languages and codes and secret codes. And so when I developed an interest in being a teacher, involving Braille in that just seemed a natural extension for a career path. And it has been one of my most favorite things to teach as a vision rehab therapist.
Fabulous. Thank you. I know you are both true champions of Braille, and your passion and enthusiasm always get me excited. And I know you'll have lots of wonderful insights to share with us today. We're going to be talking about how to approach the topic of Braille with older adult clients and consumers, as well as how our own philosophies and attitudes as professionals can have an impact on their interest and motivation. And so I thought we'd get started. I'm just going to throw out a couple of common statements that we hear about Braille. I'm also a teacher of Braille. I've been teaching for a number of years, and I know I've heard these. I'm sure both of you have heard these statements too. The first one is, no, I don't need it. Maybe you're doing an assessment. You ask the client, are you interested in learning Braille? They say no, and you move on to the next question. But Natalie, what thoughts come to mind when you hear someone say, no, I don't need Braille?
Yeah, that is such a common statement. And I think when I hear that as a practitioner, I try to explore what underlying misconceptions might be leading to that. And there are different kind of misconceptions that might be playing a role, right? So one common one is that Braille is only for people who are totally blind. And of course, many adults we work with have some functional vision. I remember a client who told me about a time when he walked into a Braille learning group and saw all these people with white canes and guide dogs, and thought, oh, wow, this really isn't for me, and then walked out. And so I think, for those of us who teach Braille to adults, that's where it becomes really important to maybe explore, even for people who have low vision, how Braille might be able to enhance their independence, or to talk to them about how people with low vision might use Braille as just kind of like that additional tool in the toolbox, that it's not an either or. So that's definitely one common misconception at play there.
Great, thank you. Polly, what do you think of when you hear somebody say, it's hard, those dots are so small, right? I think you've probably heard that before, right?
Yeah, and so that's where I would also want to investigate why they think that. You know, a lot of people will have seen Braille perhaps on public signage where they, you know, will touch an elevator panel. And of course, it seems hard and complicated because they have no idea what they're touching. So I will, particularly if it's a person that I think would benefit from learning Braille, I want to do my best to make it not seem so hard and overwhelming. So I will try to give them an analogy about learning an instrument or playing or learning a new language, where you're going to start with Mary Had a Little Lamb, something very simple, and work your way up to something more complicated. And I think it's important to also make sure that they know they have choice in terms of how much Braille that they learn. That if you are offering them Braille lessons, you're not going to be forcing them to learn the whole code and all the contractions, that you're really going to support their adjustment to vision loss by helping them use Braille in a manner and to the extent which specifically suits their individual situation.
That sounds like a great response. Excellent. Natalie, anything to add? And feel free to say, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with what Polly has said. And I think the other aspect is that for people who don't know Braille, it just seems like this jumble of dots, right? And so often what I will do at the start of Braille instruction is just briefly explain the logic of the Braille system. And, you know, kind of pointing out that there really is no logic to print, right? Like there's no reason why an A looks like an A or a B looks like a B. But we know that there is that logic to the Braille system where once you learn the first 10 letters, you kind of have that key to learn the rest of the alphabet, but also the numbers. And, you know, it takes time to practice and develop those tactile skills or that tactile sensitivity, but understanding the logic behind the system can often empower new learners so that they feel a bit more in control, like once it makes sense that there really is a logic behind it, and that all the literacy skills they bring with them as people who used to read print will help them as well when they're learning Braille.
Natalie, I think you touched on an important aspect of the fears that people have, and that's the fear of not being able to distinguish anything by touch. And one of the things that I've tried in the past is I will have someone just feel a full Braille cell versus an L versus an A, which of course have great tactual disparity. And usually if they can feel the differences, that gives them the confidence to take the next step towards possibly learning Braille themselves. Try to help them over that fear.
I love that you're both talking about confidence building and a sense of control, having the learner feel those. I think that's wonderful. Another common thing we hear clients say is, I'm too old to learn Braille. Now, I know I've worked with folks in their 90s. I'm sure you guys have worked with a lot of older adults. Natalie, what thoughts come to mind when you hear someone say, I'm too old to learn Braille?
Yeah, that's also a very common statement we'll hear. And I think that relates to a lot, relates quite a bit to ideas we might be carrying about older adults or our ability to learn new skills as we get older. And I think it also relates to this idea that Braille is only for people who really want to read extensively, which some older adults do, right? They may want to read a novel, and that's great. But you can also learn Braille for labeling or for spot reading tasks or for reading elevator buttons. And so I think talking to older learners about the different ways that they could apply Braille to their lives, and that they don't, you know, they can learn Braille for a very specific targeted purpose, and then decide once they've been introduced to it when they're ready to move on based on what their needs are, right? And so trying to find that immediate moment of success for older adults is really important. I mean, it's important for all learners, but once you've learned letters A and B, you can immediately apply that to labeling 2 cans of soup so that you can easily tell them apart. So just providing them with that immediate moment of success so that then they have that motivation to continue learning if it relates to their goals.
Yeah,
I
that's
have
great.
found, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I have found that older adults are often more comfortable with Braille in a certain sense. They're often people who did not grow up with smartphones or technology. They were pencil and paper people. And I'll never forget this one client whose family had really pushed him into using an iPhone and using Seeing AI. And he was getting so frustrated at the fact that he had to boot up the app every time he wanted to pick something from his pantry, that he was actually really happy to learn how to use a slate and stylus to make his own labels, because it just sort of fit his way of doing things in a sense that was more familiar and comfortable to him.
Going unplugged can sometimes be very empowering, right?
Yes.
Excellent.
That's so true. And if I could add really briefly to that, completely agree with you, Polly. And I'm thinking of, diabetes is quite common with older adults at times. And I think there is a bit of a misconception that if you have diabetes, maybe you shouldn't consider Braille. But I think it's really important to just evaluate each learner that's in front of you, because it really depends on your specific situation, but also how you want to use Braille, right? With reduced tactile sensitivity, depending on how extensive that is, maybe you won't be able to achieve like a certain reading speed. But if you're using Braille for just spot reading tasks in the home, like to identify labels, you might be perfectly fine. And so just kind of working with each learner that you have in front of you, and kind of going from there.
Excellent. Well, Polly, I'll throw this one to you. What thoughts come to mind when you hear somebody say that they need to learn Braille, because that's what blind people do?
Okay, so when I hear someone say I need to learn it because they have this sense that that is what blind people do, they think that Braille skills come with the white cane, just as a matter of fact. That's when I, again, pause and see where that is coming from. Are they getting pressure from people they may have met even in the blind community who are very pro Braille and just think that everybody should have Braille without actually looking at that particular individual's situation? So that might be one place where that's coming from. They might also be feeling internal pressure, based on whatever they've picked up in media or society, that to be a quote unquote good blind person, that they need to be proficient in Braille. And again, while I'm never going to tell a person they should not learn Braille, again, we have to cycle back and see where that is coming from. I think the takeaway I like to bring the individual back to is, regardless of how you feel about what you should do, what is it you're going to do that will benefit you in the immediate future? So do you have a short-term goal where using some sort of Braille in your life is going to cause an immediate improvement? The door for Braille and for learning more Braille is something that I always want to keep open with clients.
I love that. Focus on the what are you going to do rather than the what you should. Love it. Excellent. Well, Natalie, I'll have you start off on this one, but I'd love to hear from both of you with your thoughts on, what comes to mind when you hear people say that they want to learn Braille in case their vision gets worse. And I know we'll talk a little bit more in depth about this in just a little bit, but what are your initial thoughts when you hear somebody say this? I want to learn Braille in case my vision gets worse.
Well, I mean, first of all, the earlier you learn Braille, the better, right? So that's great kind of planning on the part of any potential, like prospective learner. But the important piece for me here is to really find how Braille might help that learner right away, right? Because if you learn, and this is true for anything we learn, if you learn something that you don't plan on using now, but you plan on using in the future, you probably won't practice it very much, right? And it won't have that kind of like meaningful application to your daily life outside of learning. If you learn a language, but you only practice it in class and not at home, it probably won't stick. Right. So for me, when I'm working with a client who might be learning Braille because they know that their vision will change in the future, that's great. But really trying to work with them on, what are your immediate goals? What are you not able to do right now where Braille might help? And we talked about, learning some Braille to identify cans in the home. It might be learning Braille to read elevator buttons. I've had clients who become really motivated to learn Braille so that they can make a greeting card or read a print Braille book to a child or a grandchild. And I think the big takeaway here is that when you're new to Braille, you're probably not aware of all the really creative and cool ways that you can use Braille in your life. And so kind of introducing that to learners and all the different ways that Braille could be used will help them think about how it could be applied to their lives right now as well as in the future.
Right. Polly, anything to add?
I have found that when people call up where I work and say that they want to learn Braille, that this is really nothing to do with Braille. They are most commonly calling because they are afraid. They are concerned what could happen. They often have a new diagnosis of vision loss, and they're really concerned about how they're going to manage and stay independent. Braille is often, once I talk to them more often, almost the last thing on their list of priorities once we start talking about the realities of what they could be learning to stay independent. So I think this question is also a tricky one when you're dealing with someone who has a great deal of usable vision and a fairly stable condition, because you have to be conscious of their use of their time, your time, the agency's funding that pays for travel. So you're trying to balance those priorities. And so while as a professional, you don't want to crush anyone's enthusiasm for Braille, because a little Braille can be a very good thing, you also have to make sure that you're having the proper assessment conversation with them to be sure that you are identifying what they actually need right now. And it may be that through that conversation, they come to realize that, yes, they still want to learn Braille at some point, but perhaps right now it's more important that they learn how to get to the grocery store safely, or use their stove and use their knife in their kitchen without slicing their finger like they've been doing. So you have to make sure that all of their other basic needs and goals have been covered before a significant portion of their time and energy goes into learning Braille, which may not be as needed at this point.
So prioritizing.
Prioritizing,
helping
yes.
them.
Yeah, you're not
prioritize
shutting
for
the door on
themselves.
Braille, but you're helping them realize that it may not be the answer to the problems that they are imagining. I'll never forget one client who said, well, I need to learn Braille so that I can read my mail. And I said, well, does your mail come in Braille? And she said, well, no. And so we had a very good conversation about some really practical ways that Braille could help her right now. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, well, this one I heard from a client. She said her family actually told her this. So I'm curious to see what you both think of this. If you learn Braille, you're giving up on your vision. Natalie, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, another really common misconception. I think, the more tools you have in your toolbox, the better it is, right? Because you may need a different tool in each context, right? So a really common example, for example, is if you're giving a presentation, you might not have enough vision to be able to kind of refer to your notes very easily, right? And so Braille can be a really great tool to kind of very subtly refer to your notes while giving a presentation without having to put the page right up to your face. But you might be able to use your vision in other contexts. Some people find that reading, studying in Braille is a lot more helpful than listening to text, for example, with a screen reader, because it's kind of a bit more active, you're engaging with the information. And so what I would tell a new learner is to just kind of view these as all different tools that could work together, right? It's not an either or. You could use your vision in some contexts, you could use Braille in others, but having these tools gives you that option, right? If you don't learn Braille, then you don't have the option to use it when it would be helpful.
Polly, anything to add?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how, as VRTs, we're working with the client and often with the family. And the example that came to my mind was the microwave and the washing machine. I remember having a conversation with a husband and wife. They knew that the husband, who had the visual impairment, could work the microwave and the washing machine by identifying either the round or the square bump dots. But as I explained Braille, I said, well, if we use Braille letters, or you are willing to learn a little Braille, then you won't have to remember what these dots mean, that we could simply put C for the cold wash and H for the hot and W for the warm. And we could mark the popcorn setting and the beverage setting and different things on these appliances so that you could simply read it and not have to remember. And I think that speaks to what Natalie said, that we are giving them more options. It is going to support anything that they're already doing.
Wonderful. All right. Well, this statement I've heard from professionals. I've actually heard folks say older adults just don't want to learn Braille. They're not interested in learning Braille. And Natalie, I know you did some research on this topic, and I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about the highlights from that research and the impact.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I became really interested in Braille and aging and kind of doing research in that area when I still worked as a VRT, because I very quickly kind of discovered that there are very few resources to guide us as VRTs when working with adults or older adults who want to learn Braille, right? There's tons of resources to support children, but not as many for adults. And so one of the things that I quickly found that won't be a surprise to anyone is that there's very little research on Braille and aging. So I found 40 articles that kind of explored the topic of Braille and different kind of capacities that are important for Braille reading, like tactile sensitivity and working memory and motor skills that do change with age. And of those articles, very few actually included people above the age of 60. And even in those cases, those were lifelong Braille readers, so a very different type of Braille reader. And so the big kind of practical takeaway from that is that we need more research. And even more than that, if you look at the research that exists, there have been so many different assessment tools that have been used to, for example, assess tactile sensitivity in adults. And I found over 19 instruments that were used in these studies, and they all lead to different results, right? Inconsistent results in terms of the relationship between Braille reading and the tactile sensitivity of the participant. And so what we need to understand as practitioners from that is that you really want to avoid making generalizations based on the results of one specific assessment, right? Because Braille is just as complex as reading print, right? Where touch is one aspect, but we also draw on all kinds of other skills when we're reading, whether it's print or Braille. We're drawing on our working memory and our previous literacy experiences. So you really want to take the time to really understand the learner that's in front of you. But one of the main takeaways that kind of relates to your question about older adults, Jennifer, is that I found from the research that I've done is that there are most of the factors that really relate to Braille reading ability among older adults are things that really go back to policy and practice, right? So I looked at tactile sensitivity and motor skills and working memory and all kinds of other things. And what we found is that the most significant factors that are related to Braille reading performance are how often you read Braille, so frequency of Braille usage, and how early on you start learning Braille. And these are things that we could improve through policy and practice changes. So as VRTs, you can think about, you might only see a client once a week or even less. And so thinking about how can you ensure that learners have opportunities to practice Braille every day. It might be drawing on external resources, distance learning courses, activities that they can do at home. But that will make a really big difference because even two learners who learn Braille at the same age in older adulthood will differ if one of those learners reads Braille every day. So it isn't age that's primarily influencing Braille reading ability. It's really how often they're learning Braille and whether they have those really meaningful opportunities to learn Braille. And I think the last thing I would say here, Jennifer, is that when interviewing adults and older adults who have learned Braille, what's really interesting is that these are the primary barriers that were really highlighted, right? That often it's very difficult to find access to Braille learning, or there are long waiting lists, or there are not lots of opportunities to practice Braille between sessions. And so that's really interesting because knowing that this is so important, we can start thinking about, okay, how can we address this in, how we're working with clients?
Sounds like there's work we can do, right? Additional work we can do, but that older adults are interested. So it's up to us to make them those meaningful experiences and make them set them up in a way with policies and procedures that can make them a more successful experience too, right?
Definitely.
So great. Well, thank you. And Polly, now I think another, kind of key factor in terms of the interest level of the clients that we work with is our own attitude as professionals about Braille. I know sometimes it can manifest itself in some ways, such as maybe everybody gets Braille, no matter what. Or the reverse, people only get Braille if they specifically ask for it, or if their vision's at a certain level. I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about the importance of, considering how our own personal experience with learning Braille has an impact on how we present it to clients and how that might impact their interest and motivation level too.
I think your question also relates to not only one's own personal philosophy, but also what your employer's philosophy might be as well, because there certainly are programs that a person can attend where everyone is going to get every kind of skill, no matter what. And regardless of whether that person actually is going to use Braille right now in their life, it may not be a choice for them. It may just be something that they're exposed to. As a professional, I definitely think our own experience of learning Braille definitely can influence that. And let me talk about two sides of that coin. You know, I think you might be speaking of professionals who really suffered learning Braille, who come out of their programs and they're like, man, Braille is just so complicated and hard. And if they're sighted or if they're having trouble reading it tactually, that's really going to dampen their confidence that they can actually produce through instruction a person who can read Braille proficiently. I think it also goes the other way. You know, I took Braille, loved it, didn't have a problem with it. And then when I talked to clients, I think in my early years, I had too much enthusiasm that kind of overwhelmed them, which also can lead to a result of the client feeling like, whoa, that's way too much. I don't want to learn all those contractions. You're making it sound too complicated. So I think, you know, you have to look at your own experience of Braille, but you also have to listen to yourself in terms of what is coming out of your mouth when you're talking to clients. You don't want to overwhelm them. I think a softer approach works, which is why, as I mentioned, I'll tend to, you know, sneak Braille into the work that I'm already doing with them, if I think it's appropriate, by suggesting a Braille letter instead of a bump dot be that label. So you're already sticking your toe in the door of creating positive associations of Braille, because the client, when they're early on working with you, they're not able to make that informed decision about whether or not they're going to learn Braille or even how much Braille they're going to learn. And you as a professional, while you do have some experience and knowledge and certainly professional perspective, I think it's important for us also to kind of keep the door open in terms of what our judgment might be as to what that person is going to need. So I think if both professional and client approach Braille slowly and carefully, you're leaving the door open for creating a proficient Braille reader who may end up using Braille labels, but who may also be perfectly happy setting their washing machine or playing cards, and that's it. You know, that's the extent of their Braille, but that is still a success. And if the client feels like they are a success and they're independent using Braille as they wish, then that is really, I think, the ultimate goal for professionals.
All right. Well, Natalie, one other thing I excuse me, I've noticed is that sometimes resources are wonderful. And when we find resources to help learners or our clients learn Braille, it's fabulous. But I notice that sometimes professionals can maybe rely or depend on these resources a little too much and use them as what I call a way out. And an example would be if you find a great resource, you set up the client with that resource, and then you walk away, you're done, right? And you miss a lot of opportunities to reinforce their Braille skills or to support them in their Braille learning, because you know your thinking is, well, the other resource took care of it, I'm good to go. And it's a balancing act, right? Because we have limited time, we want to make the best use of resources. But Natalie, what would you say, to that thought of kind of using resources as a way out, and how professionals can still be involved in supporting their clients with Braille learning, even when they use other resources?
Definitely, absolutely. I think it's really important to think creatively about resources, right? Some learners do really well learning independently and on their own, but not everybody does. And so thinking about, okay, how can you incorporate external resources to support what you're doing with clients, right? So you might work with a client once a week or once every 2 weeks, but also let clients know about distance learning options like Hadley, which I'm sure we'll touch on later as well. You may also explore other ways that what you're doing with clients could be supported through external resources. So for example, if you are a sighted VRT, you might be a great instructor, but a client might really benefit from seeing firsthand examples of a Braille reader right? And so there are community peer support groups or virtual adult Braille learning resources that are available where clients could network and meet others who are learning Braille in adulthood or who have been using Braille throughout their lives. And that could provide not only just added motivation that you may not be able to provide as someone who's sighted, but also insights about new ways that those clients might want to use Braille in their own lives. We've been talking a lot about, you can use Braille for spot reading tasks, and that may be enough to meet your needs. But while speaking to other Braille users, you may discover that, you know what, I actually do want to go on to learn contracted Braille or even just a few contractions. And those are conversations that might just flourish naturally when you're speaking to other Braille users. So just think about, whether it's accessible library services so that clients could get books in Braille that kind of relate to their interests, or peer support, or distance learning. These are all ways that can kind of help clients start to use Braille right away while you're working with them directly to teach some of those Braille mechanics and hand movements that might be a bit harder for some learners to learn independently.
Great. Lots of ways to utilize those wonderful resources, but still be involved yourself in supporting. Great. So Polly, when it comes to who should learn Braille, I know this has kind of been mentioned a little bit earlier, but can you speak a little bit more to how maybe an eye condition, prognosis, level of vision, or the ability to learn might have an impact? And just one example I have is professionals may say, well, somebody with glaucoma, they might be a candidate for Braille, so we'll recommend Braille to them. But somebody with macular degeneration, we won't even mention Braille because they can use low vision devices. What are some insights related to this kind of line of thinking?
I think what you're saying is perfectly true, that a lot of people will have heard from their eye doctor or from the community that, oh, I have macular degeneration, I'm never going to go blind. But again, it boils down to the conversation you have with the individual to see what they're doing or not doing in their life, having that assessment, and then seeing how they feel about Braille, if they're open to it, if it looks that logically knowing some Braille and incorporating it into daily tasks would improve their efficiency, then I think it's a conversation that you would definitely want to have with them. I know that some professionals have felt that certain eye conditions, particularly ones that have a person with a high degree of usable vision and little chance of additional vision loss, may say, oh, you have too much vision for Braille. I think that we still hear things like that. But again, we want both the client and ourselves to come to an informed decision as to what is the best plan for that client. So when I'm working with someone who may have an eye condition that gives them a lot of usable vision, and the prognosis is that they will probably have fairly stable vision for a long time, such as with macular degeneration, the dry kind, which is very gradual. It may be years, if not decades, where they would be unable to use magnification to accomplish the tasks that they're doing. That's a possibility. So depending on what the person says is what will affect what I say next as a professional. So they may be someone who says, well, I've been diagnosed as legally blind and I need to have Braille. Give me Braille lessons. That's where I want to talk to them about misconceptions they might have around Braille, and then really work with them to set some priorities for their immediate needs and their midterm needs. And then often they'll see that Braille becomes more of a long-term goal. So they may decide, okay, you're right. We've talked, I realize I can't do this, I can't do that, and my magnifier is going to work just fine for now. So after I've worked with them for a while on these goals, then they will have the opportunity to learn Braille. Now, I think the pressure that we often face as professionals is that we know that Braille is a lot of our time and the client's time. So we have to be sure that this is the right path to take. And I think sometimes when a person has a high degree of usable vision, you know, we don't see it as a high priority. And I think that that's fair because we are stewards of the employer's resources. So we do have to be careful of that.
Great, thank you. Well, okay, so we're going to jump ahead to going ahead and just introducing Braille. I want to get a little more in depth into some of the statements we had earlier. And Natalie, I'm just wondering if you had any more to add about like what you might say to someone in that first conversation when you hear them say they don't want Braille. Are there anything
Absolutely.
particular you might address?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's playing off what Polly just mentioned actually, is that in that first conversation, you're getting to know the client, and adults are experts in who they are, right? And who they are as learners, right? And so you really want to include them in determining, obviously, and guiding what their goals are. And so in that first conversation, I'll talk to them about what Braille is and the different ways that you can use Braille in your daily life. The fact that there are, you know, Braille board games and Braille playing cards and Braille bingo and things that they may not be aware of, not to overwhelm them, but to expand their understanding of all the possibilities that are open to them, that often I find that clients are really excited about because they just didn't realize that you can find Braille on all these different products and all these different things. And then the other aspect of that first conversation is to talk to them more to understand who they are. You know, what are they no longer able to do? And in determining that, in figuring out what that is and what their goal is, I think it's easier to kind of help them see how Braille isn't really this tool that disables you. It's not a symbol of disability. It's actually something that you can use to take back control in vision loss and to regain that independence that you might have lost. And I think what sets us apart from maybe other vision professionals who work more in medical settings is that we don't just see the eye condition, right? We see the whole person. And that learner with vision loss who might feel intimidation or might be, you know, be reluctant to learn Braille or to learn how to use a white cane, they come with a lifetime of experiences, right? And some of those are literacy experiences. And I've had clients who really identified strongly as readers when they were sighted. You know, they loved the smell of a physical book and they loved spelling and being able to read on their own. And I think that's something to really know when you have a new learner in front of you, to learn about those previous learning experiences, those previous literacy experiences, because sometimes you might think that giving them audiobooks might address their reading needs, but it doesn't really help them kind of reconnect with that identity of being a reader. And so I think just in that first conversation, helping them understand all the possibilities of Braille, but also who they are, and making those connections with Braille will be really helpful as a starting point.
Great. I like that. They are the experts in themselves, right, as learners. So tapping into that. Polly, did you have any more you wanted to add about what you might say in the first conversation with someone who says they want to learn Braille? because they're afraid of losing their vision, or they just think it's expected. Anything else you'd like to?
Well, I would like to touch on the fact that nothing can seem more emotionally charged than talking about white canes or Braille with people who are new to vision loss. There is a lot of cultural, or I would say societal baggage to unpack there with a lot of people in terms of discovering what does that represent in their head for them. And once you learn, as Natalie says, who they are and what reading means to them, you can start to fit that in with what you're going to say to them in terms of how they might be using Braille. And I love Natalie's example of, people who were past readers and helping them reconnect with that part of their identity. I think one of the best things I ever did as a sighted professional was to put myself through the experience of learning to read Braille tactually. I will confess I never made it to the end of the code, but I had enough under my belt that I could speak from that perspective of knowing that when you read to yourself in Braille, it matches the experience of reading by sight, in that it is at your own pace and you're hearing all those characters and words in the voices in your head, unlike reading an audiobook. And I think that that is just so powerful. The other thing that I like to do is with prospective Braille students who may be on the fence is to sort of match them up as informally as possible with another client who has learned Braille, who is hopefully of a similar age and situation, so that they can find some points of connection. I found that it didn't, depending on the person, it didn't always work so well if I picked a mentor who had been reading Braille their whole lives, because often the comments I got back from my client were the fact was, oh, that person's been doing it since they were a child. It's easy for them. So I sort of stopped using, class A examples of Braille users and started tapping into past clients who had been through those same struggles and learned Braille as an adult to really help people relate, as well as Natalie said, to find that inspiration and motivation for thinking, wow, it's really great to be able to read that word on my microwave. Maybe I would like to try reading more Braille. And it just, as Natalie says, we're not from the medical, we're there for the whole person. And what better outcome than to see a Braille student go from reading a label to enjoying novels again.
Great. Well, I know both of you have talked a lot about really finding out what specific goals clients have, what's meaningful to the clients. And Natalie, I think we'll kind of wrap things up a little bit. We'll talk about resources at the very end briefly, but just to wrap up the main part of our time together, if you could just talk a little bit about the importance of discovering those specific goals and thinking outside the box and outside of the standard Braille curriculum.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, each learner is different, right? We're all different. And there is no such thing, I think, as a standard adult Braille learning curriculum, right? You have to cater it to each learner's needs and interests and motivation, right? When you're new to Braille, it can be very exhausting to read Braille tactually until you develop that kind of fluency and comfort level. And so to kind of maintain interest and motivation, I really like to vary the activities and be as creative as possible based on what I know the learner's interests are. So, if we might read Braille for a little while and then switch over to a game of Braille, Braille playing cards, or play Braille anagrams where I give them a list of words that they need to unscramble, or mix and match where they get, Braille labels that they need to either match up or put in numeric or alphabetical order. I've played Braille bingo during Braille lessons. These are all ways to practice Braille, right? Without actually knowing that you're practicing Braille. and it's fun for many learners, but it's also it also helps them just kind of discover naturally the different ways that they could use Braille.
Great. All right. Well, I think in the interest of time, we had mentioned resources earlier, and we do have a list of resources to help you as professionals with learning Braille, with considerations for when you're teaching Braille. And I think, ladies, if you agree, we'll put that into a handout and make that available on the OIB-TAC website. Sound good?
Perfect.
All right. So just to wrap up, I want to give you the opportunity to share any closing thoughts about the idea of introducing Braille before we sign off. So, Natalie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation, and I think I'm just really excited that we're here talking about Braille. I think we do need to talk about Braille more often in adult kind of vision rehabilitation and ways that we can support adults and older adults who want to learn Braille. And so I think we just keep these conversations going and continue to see that Braille is just an additional tool in the toolbox, even beyond childhood.
Great. Thank you. Polly, how about you?
Just thinking how my older adult clients have been wonderful Braille students. And I think this is because they are a population that often has more time, but also that self-awareness of knowing how they like to learn, what they like to read or not read. And it makes goal setting with them so easy, and they are so motivated and task oriented that I would say if you're a professional who has maybe shied away a little bit from offering Braille to older adults, that you give it a try, because there are benefits. And just know that you don't have to teach the whole code. You only have to teach what that person is going to enjoy using in their life.
Great. Well, I cannot thank you both enough for your wisdom, your sharing your experiences, your examples, your perspectives. They've been incredibly helpful, and we hope they will be a great support to all of you. And we hope that your next experience will be very successful each and every time you introduce Braille.